So make sure this is number 10. Number 10. And we're talking about some decimals today. So a decimal is just a number. It's a special type of number. So it's a number that is written with a point. All right, that dot is your decimal point. All right, it's the part that looks like a dot. Separating the part greater than 1, which would be your whole number, and the part less than 1, which is what actually forms the decimal. When you have a decimal, you have a number in front. That's your whole number, which is bigger than 1. And then you have your piece, like your 0.75 or your 0.8 or your 0.11. That's going to be your part less than 1. And that piece is what actually causes us to need a decimal. Place value is something we've talked about before. We've talked about how when we add and subtract and multiply and divide and all that, we have to line up the place value. We mentioned that the past 2 weeks. We're going to actually write that definition down, give us a good formal definition. The place value is the value of where the digit, which is another way of saying number, but we don't want to say number in a number, so we'll say the digit is located in a number. When we're talking about a specific part of a number, we'll call that the digit that we're mentioning. All right. Now, when we're talking about place value, it is the value of where it's located. We'll talk about that in 2 different ways. We'll talk about it by naming the place, and then we can also talk about it by the actual value amount. And we're going to look at that a little bit in this chart. All right, raise your hand if you need more time with the definition. Okay. All right. As we saw on last week's test, when we have vocabulary, that vocabulary will show up on a test. It won't be on the quiz this Friday, but it will be on the test next week. Delaney?
I know what a decimal is. Like an actual number that's a decimal that you can use like a problem. Pi.
So pi is an example of a decimal that's used throughout math. We will not use pi very much in here, but in the 7th grade when you start talking about circles, you will use pi, which kind of makes sense since pi is typically in the shape of a circle when you think about the food. Okay. All right, Chris, I'm going to let you copy this at the end, okay? All right, let's go ahead and look at that place value chart. Zoom out a little bit so we can see what we're doing. There we go. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is just we're going to go in and name the location of each number. So the 3, the 5, and the 4, that number in front of the decimal, what location would that be considered? What would we call that? Macy? The ones. And if you need to turn your paper to fill that in, you can. So that's my ones place. All right, if I wanted to know the actual value of that, so this 3, the value of a 3 in the ones place is 3. The value of a 5 in the ones place is 5. All right. Let's talk about my place location for that 4 and that 2. What would I call that location? Brianna? The tens. All right. And what would the value of that 4 actually be? Raise your hand if you think you tell me. What is the value of the 4? Connor? 40. All right. If I wanted to know just the value of the 4, it would be 40. What about the value of the 2? Morgan? 20. Perfect. All right, and we're going to look at some more of this later on this week, just a little reminder for how that works as we review and get ready for the quiz. All right, what about the 1? What is that location? Rubian? The hundreds. And what would the value of that be? Kinsley? 100. Okay. If I did have a number in the next location, what would that next location be called? Chandler? The thousands. And then after thousands, we have 10,000. After 10,000s, we would have 100,000s. After 100,000s, we would have millions, 10 millions, 100 millions, billions, 10 millions, 100 millions, trillions, 10 trillions, 100 trillions. Quadrillions. All right. So that tens, hundreds repeats each time in between until you get a new value, a new place. All right. What about these numbers after the decimal, the 2, 1, and 0? What is that called? Chris? Tenths. The tenths. I like how he emphasized that TH at the end, the tenths. So the value for that 2 would be 0.2. The value for the 1? 0.1. All right, what about the 5, the 0, and the 7? Kinsley? The hundredths. What would the value of the 7 be? Emma? What would the value of the 7? What would it be? Be 7 hundredths, which would just be 0.07. What's the value of the 5? Kinsley? 0.05. You're basically filling in zeros for everything but that number that we're talking about specifically. All right, what's the location for the 6 and the 9, Connor? Thousandths. All right, and that 9, the value would be 0.009. The 6 would be 0.006. All right, the 8. What's that location going to be? Brianna? 10,000ths. Okay. Any questions about the place value? All right, we'll talk about that and review that again some more later this week as we get ready for our quiz. We do have a quiz on Friday. All right, we're not doing any more of the multiplication time test. That was done. We did our test Friday. We're done with those. So this Friday we just have one quiz on adding and subtracting and multiplying our decimals, which we'll do multiplication tomorrow. Remember on Friday y'all got an exponent sheet, that coloring sheet. I told you didn't have to work on it over the weekend. Throughout this week you need to find some time to work on it because at the end of class Friday I'll expect you to turn that in. So when you finish with your quiz, if you have time to work on it, you can. If not, you'll turn in what you were able to get done this week, okay? So that doesn't mean go home and do it all tonight. You have this whole week, all right, to work on it, and I'll take that up at the end of class Friday. Okay, y'all good with that? All right. I forgot to mention that earlier. And it says, if you look up on the homework board, it says on Friday if that exponent worksheet is due Friday. All right. All right. Number 1 on our example. So we're looking at adding and subtracting decimals. So before we actually do the math, what is like the number 1 rule when you're adding and subtracting decimals? It's basically the same as when you're adding and subtracting whole numbers. Kayla? Yeah, you got to line them up. You got to line them up by place value. And the decimals, the great thing about them is they have that little dot that helps to make sure you're doing everything right. So we're going to make sure that we always line up the decimal. Because if I line up the decimal, should all my other place values line up correctly? If those decimals are lined up, my other place values should line up. Okay, so we're going to make sure we line up the decimals when we're adding and subtracting. Okay. So with that said, on number 1, we're going to do 9.55 plus 18.9. So you'll notice my decimals are in a straight line. I didn't just put the 9 and the 5. I didn't line those up at the end. I used that decimal to make my line, to make sure we're lining them up. So what do you notice is kind of weird looking about this problem? Danny?
It doesn't have a hundreds decimal.
Yeah, so we have a gap here where the 9, that 18.9 didn't have a hundredths. So what could I do to fill in that gap? Christy? Put a 0 there. Okay, so now when we add that up, 5 and 0 is 5 and 9. 14, carry the 1. 1 and 9 is 10, plus the 8. 18, carry the 1. 1 and 1 is 2. So I get 2,845.
No,
No, what's wrong?
you need the decimal.
I need the decimal. And guys, do you see how I gave my decimal an extra gap? And then in my answer, didn't that gap look weird? Which helps me remember to make sure to write my decimal. Those are all just little techniques that help you catch some common mistakes that happen. All right, so give your decimal an extra space so that when you write your answer, it's like, ha! Make sure to write that in there, okay? All right, let's look at number 2. So I have, for subtraction, remember we have to keep that in that order. You cannot change things around. So I have 93.5, giving myself some extra room because for subtraction I have to borrow. Borrowing without some space can get really, really messy. All right, I'm going to go ahead and put my decimal up underneath so I can make sure they are in a straight line. What number was in front of my other decimal? What number is in front of that? 79. So I'm going to put 79 in front, lining up my 1s and my 10s. And behind the decimal is? 17, making sure my 1 lines up. So I have an empty gap here. What do I need to put in that gap? A 0. If I don't put the 0, then I won't realize. Can I do 0 minus 7? No, I won't realize that I need to borrow. So I'm going to borrow from my 5. What's 5 going to become? 4. And the 1 that I took away, just put in front of the next door. So now I have 10 minus 7, which is? 3. 4 minus 1? 3. 3 minus 9? Borrow. 9 becomes? 8. And we put that 1 next door to our neighbor. So now I have 13 minus 9, which is? 4. And 8 minus 7? 1. And again, y'all can see my number. Does it look right? No, I have a gap. So I'm going to make sure to fill that decimal in that missing gap. Okay. Questions about 1 or 2? Those are just like straightforward adding, subtracting. All right. Number 3. Number 3, we have to line up the decimals, but what do you notice about number 3? Danny? Yeah, 29 doesn't have a decimal because it's a whole number. Okay, so you can add a 0.00 to it. I want you to think about something because I have some people all the time, they're like, they forget where the decimal goes. Does it go in front? Does it go behind? When you're numbering your paper, you put 1 dot, 2 dot, 3 dot, 4 dot, 5 dot. What is that dot that you're putting? You're putting a decimal. Did you ever think of it as a decimal? Probably not. You're just like, period. A period in math is a decimal. So if this is 29, it's the number 29, period. That's the end of the number, right? So when I write 29, I'm going to put 29, period. That's the end of that number. Just like the end of a sentence in English. End of my number gets a period if it doesn't have one. Okay. So now underneath that, I can put my other decimal. What's in front of that decimal? 15. And behind that decimal? 42. So this time I have 2 gaps. So what am I going to add to my 29? 2 zeros. All right. Does that make sense? For that 29, it's 29, period. It's the end of the number. Okay. You'd be surprised. There are a lot of relationships between like English grammar and math. I always like grammar. I'm not the best writer. I'm going to be honest. I like reading. I'm not great at it. But when it comes to writing, I'm not good at words. All right. But I do like grammar because it's very much like math. There are rules and you follow the rules and you get it right. And I like when it's like that. I like that kind of schoolwork. All right. For me. Okay. So I've got them all lined up. I got my zeros added. So we're going to try to subtract now. Everyone's okay with it. If it's a whole number, it's the whole number then period, then your decimal. Okay? 0 minus 2. Can I do that? No. So I'm going to borrow, but can I borrow from 0? No. Some of y'all like the trick where I showed you that you can borrow from 90. If you don't, that's okay. I'm going to go back to the regular way that we're used to borrowing. So 9, when I take 1 away, it becomes 8. I have to hand it to the next door number, so to the neighbor. So now that's a 10. I can borrow from 10. It becomes 9, and I pass it next door. Now can I do 10 minus 2? 10 minus 2 is 9 minus 4, 8 minus 5, 2 minus 1. Again, I can see that gap that's missing, so I want to add my decimal. Make sure you bring it down. Okay, there we go. Are there any questions about this? All right, I'm going to pass out your homework in just a second. When I pass it out, I forgot to put numbers on it. It has numbers for your problem, but I did not number your actual worksheet. So just to kind of show you how we're going to number that, I'm going to start at the top, 1, then 2, then 3. Y'all see how I'm numbering this paper? 4, 5, 6. There is not enough space in here for you to do your work and it be neatly spaced out. You can write your answers on here, but I do want your work on your own paper. Okay? Are y'all okay with how we're numbering this? All right, I'm going to go ahead and pass that out so we can spend the rest of our period getting stuff done. Hopefully not having to take home as much